Good morning, British literature students. Welcome to the third week of our semester. And this week is going to be an eventful one because we are going to be looking at the French Revolution. So there is a slideshow in your D2L called Literature Inspired by the French Revolution. That slideshow in conjunction with the readings should help you to answer the discussion question. Now, I know that I've given you a quiz about English history up to 1800. The events of the French Revolution would actually start, probably in the early 1700s, but the French Revolution itself would kick off with the storming of the Bastille in 1789. So that's a little bit before 1800. But it's important to take that quiz on the British history because what that will do is give you some background to the actual arguments that are being made by Edmund Burke, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Thomas Paine in this week's readings. I also would like for you to read on the background of the French Revolution, both in the textbook and on the slideshow that I provided for you on the literature of the French Revolution in D2L. Now, this was a time of great turmoil, and I know what you're asking yourselves. You're probably thinking, hey, Mr. Smith, this is supposed to be a British literature class. Why are we studying writings about the French Revolution in a British literature class? And the answer to that is that the people of Britain were looking very closely at this revolution, and they were taking their cues from what was going on there. This was a major turning point in world history, and it could have been a major turning point in all of European history, because believe me, as the monarchs of the European nations are watching what's going on in France, they are worried about whether their heads are going to remain connected to their necks as well, just like Louis XVI's head was separated from his by a guillotine, as was his wife Marie Antoinette. So, all of Europe was watching what was going on during the French Revolution in France. Now, the next point I want to make about all of that is, all that history I had you read, you will see that in the three authors' writings this week. So, for example, we're going to start with the background on the French Revolution, and where the French monarchy was overthrown, and both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette got beheaded. And we're going to look at how there's not been a king of France since then. Now, Napoleon would end up being emperor of France for a little while, but even that didn't work out very well. So look at the history of the French Revolution and the series of events that would occur, starting with the reign of Louis XIV, who actually ruled France pretty much during peaceful times for 72 years. But he was a tyrant, and that would lead to his grandson, or his great-grandson, I think it is, Louis XVI, being overthrown and beheaded. So look at that, then go to Burke. Burke is a bit of a conservative, and look at his arguments for the French Revolution as you plan your discussion posting. Burke was a rich man. He was a member of Parliament, and he actually had some influence in England. And he's worried now because, remember, people are not very happy with the ruler of England at the time that this French Revolution is going on, who happens to be King George III. And oh, by the way, King George III has lost the American colonies in a war, and so the American colonies broke free to form what we now know as the United States. And King George III is starting about this time to start showing signs of insanity, and he's starting to go crazy at this point. So, of course, the people in England are wondering, hey, do we keep this guy in power, or do we just go ahead and behead him too, since his mind's gone anyway, and start our own different type of government? It's important to note that Charles I had already been overthrown and had already been beheaded. And so for 11 years during the interregnum, there was no king of England. So England had already been through all of this, overthrowing the king and beheading the king thing that was going on in France. And that would play a role in the fact that would lead to England deciding to keep its monarchy. So that's part of what's going on. So look at Burke. Burke is going to be a conservative, and he's going to say, hey, look, in 1215, King John signed the Magna Carta, and in 1689, William and Mary signed the Declaration of Right. And so, while France doesn't have the rights that we have here in England, our rights are guaranteed by these ancient documents. Burke is also going to argue that the King of France, Louis XVI, and Marie Antoinette are lovely people and therefore should not have been in prison. Because when Burke, Wollstonecraft, and Paine write these documents that you're reading now, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were still alive. Now, they were imprisoned through a series of events that led them to be in prison, but they hadn't been beheaded yet when these three readings that you're going to see have occurred. So he's going to say, hey, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are good people. There's no reason to overthrow them. There's no reason to actually behead them. And, oh, by the way, chivalry is dead, because Marie Antoinette should never have been submitted to all the horror she was submitted to, but she's such a lovely lady, if you will. So, he's also going to make these arguments. Burke is also going to make these arguments. The British system of handing down property to sons and the aristocracy having all this property has been in place for hundreds of years and has worked quite well. Thank you very much. We should keep that in place. He also says that there are rights that are guaranteed to every man, such as the rights of justice and the rights of inheritance and the right to be able to eat and the right to be able to raise children and all this stuff. However, not everybody has an equal right to income or to wealth. Only the aristocracy should be able to have those rights to wealth. That is going to be one of his arguments. And so, keep these in mind when you read the counter arguments to Burke's argument by Mary Wollstonecraft and by Thomas Paine. Now, let's go ahead and say this. Both Wollstonecraft and Paine resort to the ad hominem argument, which is arguing against the man more so than arguing against the arguments. But they will say that his arguments are fallacious, and here's why, and here's our counter arguments. So, even though they attack Burke personally, both of them do actually, they also go after his arguments. So for Wollstonecraft, she's enraged at his arguments because she's saying that Burke doesn't know how to use reason, which in the age of reason was very important. Wollstonecraft is going to lament the fact that Burke is arguing that those that are rich should continue to get richer at the expense of the poor. So that's one of her main arguments. She's also going to argue that private property has actually stopped progress, and private property actually robs those that don't have that private property of their rights. And this is a very Karl Marxian argument. If you don't know who Karl Marx is, you should Google him and find out. She's going to make the argument that only the rich are secure and that the poor are struggling and have no security whatsoever. And she's going to say, hey, of course Burke favors the rich. He's rich himself. He doesn't want to lose any of his fortune. Paine, on the other hand, is really going to get vicious. And he's going to say that Burke was wrong to attack the people of France who are revolting against their king. He's also going to make this point. He's going to make the point that the people of France are not revolting against Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, although in all truth they were revolting against Marie Antoinette. But, you know, he's going to say they're not revolting against Louis XVI, because Louis XVI is a good man himself, but they're lamenting and they are revolting against the establishment. And that establishment is an aristocracy that is living high on the hog at the expense of the poor, and the clergy, who is also living high on the hog at the expense of the poor. So Thomas Paine is going to actually say, hey, you're saying that the French people are attacking the people, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, when they're not. They're attacking a very deep-rooted tyranny that has been in place for far too long and needs to be uprooted. And it's a painful uprooting, but it's one that needs to be done nevertheless. He's also going to make the argument that Burke's arguments for the Magna Carta and for the Declaration of Right are fallacious because he's going to say, hey, dead kings cannot rule us from beyond the grave. Only the living can rule the living. The dead have no right to rule the living. So he's going to attack Burke on that front. And he's going to say, hey, when we talk about Charles I, who was beheaded right before the interregnum, in fact, his beheading led to the interregnum, and to the overthrow of James II, who, after he got overthrown, William and Mary came down from the Netherlands and took over the British throne. And they could do that because Mary was the daughter of James II, but she was a Protestant, so that made it okay. That those were the ones that were attacks against men, with Charles I and James II. But the attack against Louis XVI in France was against despotism and not against the actual people themselves. So both Payne and Wollstonecraft are going to argue that Burke is defending the rich and to hell with the poor, essentially is what they're saying. Now, I ask you these questions as you consider what you read. Does this sound familiar today? Look at the candidates for 2016's presidential election. The same arguments going on. Those that are in power and part of the establishment, according to those who are against the establishment, say the establishment wants to keep the powerful and the rich in place, and that money rules politics, and they're fine with that. Those that say they're for the people say, hey, too much money is influencing our laws, which are designed to protect the rich, and that those that are in power don't care about the poor. And so the 2016 election should be about who cares about the poor and the middle class, which the middle class is disappearing. And we've got in 2016 election, do we keep the same system in place that's in place now, or do we overthrow it and change things drastically? So all of this stuff about the French Revolution is playing out again in 2016 right here in the United States. So don't think for a minute that all this stuff we're reading from the year 1789 or the year 1790, 91 doesn't matter today, because it does matter today, and we're seeing it again. Your history teachers can tell you some things, but what you're reading is the actual pamphlets that were published at the time, not by some historian that wants to tell you in a textbook today what's going on, but from the mouths of those that were having this debate at the time themselves. So everything you're going to read this week is relevant to 2015, 2016. So take it seriously, read it closely, think deeply about it, then go to your discussion posting and make that posting. So that's all I have to say for this week. I hope that what I've said in this lecture has actually been beneficial to you and not boring, and that you'll see why we need to read this kind of literature today just as much as we did back in the 1780s and 90s. So with that in mind, happy reading, happy critical thinking, and I look forward to reading your discussion postings.